صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. We're going to start the program with the recitation of Quran.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والسماء والطارق وما أدراك ما الطارق النجم الثاقب إن كل نفس ما عليها فلينظر الإنسان مما خلق من ماء دافق يخرج من بين الصلب والترائب إنه على وجه القادر يوم تبلى السرائر وما له من قوة ولا ناصر والسماء ذات الوجه والأرض ذات الصدر إنه لقول نصر وما هو بالهزل إنه يكيدون كيدا وكيد كيدا فما الكافرين منهم عيدا. صدق الله العظيم.
Ahsan. Thank you very much for that beautiful recitation. We're now going to have a short talk by Abbas Juma. Let's welcome him. Salat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Brothers and sisters, as you're aware, we have been having a series of children's talks throughout the last few weeks, and we'll inshallah be continuing as the weeks progress. These children often have been participating in our regular classes, which do take place once a month, and they have decided to give a talk about something they're passionate about. So please welcome Abbas Juma with loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
My dear brothers, sisters and elders, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Abbas Juma, and tonight I want to talk to you about a topic I'm very passionate about: homelessness, charity and our duties. To kick things off, does anyone in the audience want to take a guess at how many homeless people there are in the world today? Not quite. A bit more. 50 under. Well, according to the World Economic Forum, it's 150 million people worldwide. That's approximately the combined population of UK and France. Alarming, right? Now, before we move on, let's take a look at what the actual dictionary definition of homelessness is. Homelessness refers to people who may be less fortunate and cannot afford essential everyday items such as food, water, clothing, and much more. There are actually three main categories of homelessness, which can be broadly distinguished as follows. Rough sleepers. These are people who mainly sleep and live on the streets. Temporary squatters. These are people who might be staying in emergency temporary shelters. Sofa surfers. The last and final category are people who live with a relative or friend because they are facing difficulties with their house. So how did my interest in this subject initially get piqued? If we look all the way back to the time of Imam Ali alayhi salam, he used to go out of his way in the middle of the night and sacrifice his time for the needy. As you probably know, Imam Ali did anything to make the poor happy, even if the most difficult of times. He was actually famous for giving away his ring in the state of ruku. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that charity is highly important in Islam. There are many quotes I have stumbled across during my research for this talk that can be taken from religion, which highlights just how important charity is to our lives. A well-known saying from Imam Hussein alayhi salam is, "The most generous of people is the one who gives to those from whom he has no hope of return." World leaders also preach about the benefits of charity. A prime example of this is the former president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, who once said, "Overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity, it is an act of justice. It is the protection of a fundamental human right, the right to dignity and a decent life." What can we take away from all these iconic sayings around practicing charity in our own lives? My take is that it is our responsibility to go out of our way to help the less fortunate, be that homeless people, those who are struggling, or those in need. We should do this not just because helping out people is recommended, but rather because it is promised that if you give something small, you will be rewarded with something even bigger from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter. Furthermore, even if it is what you perceive to be a small act, it can actually have an immense impact on the person you gave it to. It doesn't have to be a huge gesture because Allah rewards any amount, big or small. This can include your time. It doesn't have to be a monetary form of giving. Also, it is worth nothing that we should perform charitable acts simply to show off to everyone that we gave something to the poor. The best of acts are done discreetly without announcing it to anyone. It has been said that you should give with your right hand so your left hand doesn't even know. To end with, I'd like to share some of my own experiences volunteering with the Hand on Heart charity. For the past 3 years, me and my family have contributed to the charity that helps people of England that are needy. Hand on Heart have projects that are aimed to reduce poverty and save people. What they do is they give a chance for people to participate in packing bags for them to send to the streets. For each season, they allocate different types of bags with different things inside. They are separated. They separate the bags for men and women. As a child, I have found that helping the needy has changed my perception about homelessness. This has made me appreciate what I have and not take basic necessities for granted. It is everyone's duty, young or old, to help find peace within a homeless person's heart. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Once again, salawat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad. Really great to hear the young people in our community speaking about these topics that they're so passionate about. Now we've got the main program, and we're very fortunate to have Baraa Shiban, who will be speaking to us about Yemen, the current situation and the outlook for the future. Let's welcome him. Salawat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad. Baraa is the Middle East and North Africa caseworker for the London-based human rights group Reprieve. He's also a researcher with special expertise in Yemen and the Gulf region. Prior to his role in Yemen, Baraa worked for the Reprieve Yemen project, investigating the US drone program. And in 2013 to 14, he served as a member of the Yemeni National Dialogue Council, the convention tasked to negotiate Yemen's new constitution. We're very fortunate to have him today. Again, salawat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And I'm always, when I'm asked to attend such events, it's always a difficult topic because you usually, when you talk about Yemen, usually talk about the conflict. But that's certainly, for me, that's not the Yemen that I knew. That's not the Yemen that I grew up with. An important part about Yemen is it is very complicated when you look at it right now. So what I'm trying to do is as much as possible to break it down to you in different parts. And then slowly we're going to go and look back into some snippets of the history and then hopefully talk about the future of Yemen. So in order to understand the current situation of Yemen, you at least need to go back to 2011, the Arab Spring movement that energized the young Arab population across the Middle East, in many parts of the Middle East, and a significant and very important event happened was Hosni Mubarak of Egypt announced on the 10th of February to step down from power. And that's energized basically a movement that was already happening and protests that have already were going out on a daily basis in Yemen. And the main reason was because the former president of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had been the president for 33 years, announced in 2011, quite an unfortunate timing for him, that he's going to extend his term in the presidency. And he wanted to do some constitutional amendments that would allow him to run multiple times for presidency, although his term was coming to an end. The timing, as I said, was very, very unfortunate because he didn't anticipate that there would be protests happening in Egypt, in Tunisia, across the Middle East, and that basically resulted into the Yemeni public going out in protests. And the situation, if you go back to 2011, was like this. You have a ruling party, and that was starting to crumble a little bit with Ali Abdullah Saleh as the president at the head of the party. And he had been the head of the party since its creation in 1982. And he himself has been the president since late 1978. And in 2011, a frustration is growing even within his party, but also with the political class in Yemen about the attempt of Ali Abdullah Saleh to pass on the presidency to his son. That doesn't please, of course, the political elite inside Yemen, and also it disrupts the kind of political system that was had been created in Yemen since 1990. And it's important because Yemen, before 1990, didn't have a plural political system. So it was one party that ruled, and Yemen was split into South and North Yemen. The South was ruled by the Socialist Communist Party, and the South was by the General People's Congress, more of a national party, more have its affiliation. The closest thing it would be it has Arab nationalism tendencies. And with Ali Abdullah Saleh as the head of the party, but it was one party. So when the unification happened, basically now you have two parties. So both parties discussed how can we address this new system. So they agreed they should allow for pluralism. So parties were allowed to be created, and then hence the parliament started to commence its sessions based on the elections, and a relative stability happened until 1994, when the Socialist Party decided to walk away. They accused Ali Abdullah Saleh of attempting to assassinate the heads of the party, the Socialist Party at the time. Cutting the long story short, the north of Yemen, led by Ali Abdullah Saleh, was able to win a two-month civil conflict, and Ali Abdullah Saleh remained in power until 2011, when the protests started to happen. So again, speaking about the protests of 2011, the situation, if you're in Sana'a, you see this. You see a coalition bloc by the opposition parties running against Ali Abdullah Saleh. Ali Abdullah Saleh is unable to stay in power because the protests are gaining momentum. More and more people are going to the streets. The demands are increasing. The international community pressure is accumulating, and it's also increasing. But also at the same time, there were two important things happening. You have a rebel group in the north of Yemen called the Houthis, who have already fought with the central government multiple rounds. And then you have a separatist movement in the south of Yemen, who are basically kind of frustrated with how Ali Abdullah Saleh had run the country. They feel a very authoritarian regime, unlike what they were promised in 1990 following the unification. So basically, Ali Abdullah Saleh at the end of 2011 agrees to step down from power. But he signs a deal with the opposition parties, and the deal states that he would step down in exchange for immunity. So he would be granted immunity, and he would still allow to run as the head of the party, but he would step down from the presidency. His deputy would replace him in the presidency. And the significance of this is his deputy was a southerner. So that should have eased the tensions in the south, the separatist tensions in the south that were already being created for many, many years. And also a deal was proposed, backed by the United Nations at the time, that basically called for electing Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi, the former deputy president, into the presidency. And the second is forming a National Dialogue Council that would bring all parties of Yemen together to negotiate the future of Yemen and the new constitution, and then setting a timeline for elections and a referendum. So that was at least the plan on paper. I was back in the streets in 2011, and then was witnessing the negotiations that happened post the Arab Spring in 2012, until finally in 2013, the National Dialogue sessions started. And it was the first time that all Yemenis from all backgrounds and different regions of Yemen actually come together on the table and start discuss basically what do we want for the future of Yemen. And of course, like any negotiations, it gets tensed, it gets frustrated, but at least people were meeting on the table, people are talking, people are negotiating what do they want. But there remains an important element. There are certain individuals, and an individual in specific, who's still not very satisfied on the way how he exited power. So what happened was Ali Abdullah Saleh decided to start building an alliance with the Houthis in the north of Yemen. And that alliance basically proved very, very powerful, because they started to be able to take control over new territories. And I mean an actual control. So they run the police, they run the judiciary, they run the day-to-day lives. So you have a parallel system being created. But Ali Abdullah Saleh is at this time kind of satisfied by what's happening, because he thinks that if he weakened the central government quite enough, this would then allow him to come in as the savior. He's the ultimate savior who can save the day and prevent the collapse of Yemen and prevent it from descending into a civil war. Now, the National Dialogue did conclude with many articles, but there was one core component, and I think this is still relevant until today, which is the main outcome was that Yemen's the structure of the state would move from a centralized form of governance into a federal system. And there are still the negotiations on how many regions, how would it look like exactly, is still happening until today, until the day we're speaking today. So that, in a way, kind of sums up what the National Dialogue main outcome was. It says Yemen moves into a federal system, and then it starts. The proposal at the time was six regions, and then you have, in a way, Yemen kind of preserves its unity, but also allows for many of the regional grievances that have been created for over the many years to start being addressed. So basically, each region will have the ability to run its own affairs. It has a share of the wealth, and it has the ability. There is a parliament for each region that runs their own affairs. And I think it's very important here to focus on this, because this kind of hits into the core of what's the issue regarding Yemen today. Yemen has a very, very tribal society. It has very tribal identity and very regional identities. But the concept of Yemen of being a state is very old. So regardless of what you may hear from many Orientalists today, Yemenis are very familiar with the concept of a state, that their affairs are run through kind of in a system. And so it's not something new that they came up with, that how would the state look like and how would they negotiate and meet. That's the first thing. The second and important thing, it's even despite this tribal identities that exist and regional identities that exist, Yemen is very diverse in terms of its geography, in terms of its landscapes, and that basically makes it very hard to rule if you just rely heavily on a very centralized system. So there isn't one single resource that Yemenis can depend on. For example, if you compare it to what's the situation in Egypt, where it's actually the Nile is able to kind of focus the urban center around the Nile. Yemen is not like that. Yemen is very, very diverse. So the population of Yemen is scattered across a very, very vast geography. So with that amount, so you have both at the same time. You have a tribal identity, but they are very familiar with the concept of the state. It's not something new. And actually it goes very, very, very old back in history into the days of the Kingdom of Sheba, which is very well mentioned and documented in the Holy Quran. The Queen of Sheba, who ruled in North Yemen, and actually, if any of you, inshallah, would be fortunate enough to visit one day, the ruins of the Queen of the Kingdom of Sheba are still present until today. And the Temple of the Sun, when in the story of Suleiman, when basically he was told that actually وجدتها وقومها يعبدون الشمس. I came upon this queen, whom with her followers, with her kingdom, they were worshipping the sun. And the temple of the sun still exists until today. So it's the ruins, of course, exist until today. So it's kind of a testimony to the concept that actually it is a long and existing state that have continued for many centuries. The change of the internal dynamic in Yemen started in 2014. So the situation was starting to get out of the control of the central government, and starting to slowly descend into a civil war, slowly descending into a civil war. And I'm trying to take just a step back so we can understand what happened in 2015. So you have at this time the Houthis, who are a rebel group, but they're actually expanding in number, they're expanding in territory, and they are closely moving towards the capital. The central government is still promising that things are still in order. So we have scheduled elections. A referendum are still scheduled to take place in 2015, and a rising separatist movements that are basically feeling that whatever happened is still not satisfactory enough for their demands and what they were hoping to achieve. What flipped and changed the situation, of course, is the Houthis' coup in September 2014. That flipped the political dynamic in Yemen totally, because the political parties were not allowed to operate in the capital anymore. The elections was postponed until further notice, so no one can actually say when will the elections take place. And then the state structure of the way how I grew up and actually how we knew the system kind of changed. You have literally militants in the streets of Sana'a starting to take slowly the duty of the state. So even if you go, I remember at one time we had a journalist who was arrested, and we went to the police station. you literally had the police, the head of the police station, who's actually not in charge, and he said you have to talk to the militants. Those are basically Houthi commanders who basically run the show. And they're not identified, so they're not merged within the system. They basically remained as a militant group, but actually they ultimately hold the power. I'll go back to the Houthis, but I want to move until we reach the March 2015, and then I'm going to break it down into the different groups. The situation gets more complicated. I remember I was there throughout this period. So basically, you have a period of 6 months, a very, very frustrating period of negotiations that does not actually lead to anywhere. The UN is kind of slightly overseeing the situation, but actually unable to actually say with confidence that actually things are going smoothly and actually elections are going to take place. And then in January 2015, the Houthis escalate even a step further. Now, it's important to remember at this time that everything until this time, it's still coordinated with the former president. So a lot of confusion happening in the capital. Who's in charge? Who's actually running the shots? Is it the former president, or actually is it the Houthis? Who is using who? And all of that confusion is still happening. But in January 2015, they place the transitional government in its entirety, the whole cabinet, and the Yemeni president under house arrest. 1 month later, he manages to escape to Aden, to the south of Yemen, and then the Houthis start a military march into the south of Yemen, and that basically frustrated an already tense population in the south of Yemen, who have already been calling for the secession of Yemen for many, many years, even further. And it gets a rise to a very extreme separatist movement. And then the clashes started to happen around March 2015. Amongst that, all of that scene in the south of Yemen, I remember it very well because I witnessed the first moments of the clashing and the fighting that was happening inside Aden in South Yemen. Saudi Arabia decided to intervene, and that's basically after many southern voices started to arise while we were in that last month, calling for what they called an Arab intervention. So they were sending messages to the Arab League calling for it to intervene. Now, in March 2015, at the 26th of March 2015, Saudi Arabia decided to intervene. And that does two things at the same time. The first one, it did boost the confidence of the supporters of the Yemeni government, and they managed to gain a UN resolution, Security Council resolution, to back their intervention. Now, at the same time, what they did with this, it angered the population because of the means how the Saudis decided to intervene. So they decided to intervene with a massive air campaign. And that massive air campaign basically led, and I always compare that to, because Dad mentioned that I was investigating US drone strikes, and I did investigate that throughout 4 years while I was in Yemen after 2011. What happened was something similar. Basically, an air campaign would happen, they would strike a population, and then the population would get angry. And then basically that's then another means for basically the conflict the cycle of violence to basically to gain even more recruits. More people are angry, and then they attack. When the Houthis attack, they attack towns in central Yemen and in South Yemen, and that basically angers again and the population in South Yemen and in central Yemen. So and I think this is very important to explain, because a lot of confusion happens about Yemen, thinking that the conflict is related to religion or related to sectarianism, or although these elements are there, but that's not actually the primary reason for the conflict. The main reason was the political landscape got hugely disrupted with the prevention of the elections to take place. Because if you don't allow political parties to operate normally, then you are welcoming other, basically, people to identify themselves with other means. But also at the same time, the regional identity comes into play. So basically, the Houthis start recruiting from north of Yemen, and then the Saudi-backed forces, mainly the internationally recognized government, able to recruit from south and central Yemen. And that continues and continues and continues until a very important player comes into the mix. And as I said, I'll try now to break it down into all groups. So an important player is the United Arab Emirates. When the United Arab Emirates join, first of all, the conflict, they first announce they are with the coalition. They're with the Saudi-led coalition, which means they have kind of on paper a UN mandate. But what they do actually, in fact, they support exclusively the separatist movements, only the separatist movements in South Yemen. And they empower them enough that they're actually even stronger than the Yemeni internationally recognized government. So basically, that basically paves the way of rounds of conflict within South Yemen. So we're literally looking into a conflict within a conflict, basically between supporters of the new created body backed by the UAE called the Southern Transitional Council, and the supporters of the Yemeni government, mainly backed by Saudi Arabia. While at the same time, both of those groups are supposedly in conflict also with the Houthis, who are predominantly now in North Yemen. So for someone who looks into the situation, you look with very, very much frustration into this. You have a rebel group who basically didn't commit to its promises before they took control over Sana'a, and saying because the Houthis continued assuring all parties that they will commit to the outcomes of the national dialogue. At the same time, then you have a leadership who basically couldn't steer Yemen into elections. Yet now it found itself stuck in this conflict. And at the same time, a new component, which is a council called the Southern Transitional Council, backed by the United Arab Emirates, fighting both the Houthis on some fronts, but also fighting elements of the Yemeni government. And that basically creates a very, very complicated mixture make it even more complicated to resolve, because if before you wanted to resolve it between two sides, now you're adding multiple players into the mix. Move forward, 2017, the former president finally decides to break out of the Houthis. However, the Houthis have been empowered enough by this time that actually internal fighting happened within Sana'a within just 1 week, and the Houthis managed to they kill Ali Abdullah Saleh and get control. Now basically by themselves are in control of the whole scene in North Yemen. The rounds of conflict continues between the separatist groups and the Yemeni government in South Yemen. They enter several rounds of conflict in 2018 and 2019. But in 2019, the UAE manages finally to push the Yemeni government out of the interim capital Aden in South Yemen, and you have basically the separatist group in charge of the south of, especially the city of Aden, the interim capital. The Houthis are in charge of Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, and the Yemeni government are in the southern eastern part of Yemen. an attempt by Saudi Arabia to reconcile between the parties that it's supposed to be working closely with. So they do rounds of talks and negotiations between the Yemeni government and the separatist group. It results into two agreements, the Riyadh Agreement 1 and the Riyadh Agreement 2. But the most important part is the Riyadh Agreement 2, because the Riyadh Agreement 2, it did bring all of the parties that is under the Saudi-led coalition command. But, and this is very important, they managed to also get into an agreement with the Houthis to have a long-term ceasefire. And that's the first time that it have ever happened since the beginning of the conflict. So for 8 years, there was short periods of ceasefire. Would be 2 months, would be 3 months, but there hasn't been a long-term ceasefire. Now, people were skeptical at the beginning. It was April of last year. But the ceasefire until today has managed to last, has managed to hold. And the question that keeps that is remaining: how will Yemen move forward? How can we move out of this very complicated scene? And in my opinion, there are multiple steps that need to be addressed. The first thing is Yemen has to, and all Yemeni parties has to accept the concept that that there would be a plural system, because all attempts to exclude parties, the ruling party in Yemen tried to exclude the socialists in 1994, and then there was an attempt to exclude the Naserites. So all attempts to exclude parties haven't succeeded. And sometimes there would be groups who are motivated sometimes by short-term gains. So they make a military gain and then they think that actually this is it. But actually only the time has proven that actually this is short-sighted. Very soon that actually once the dynamic of power changes, this could flip. So the first thing is it should address the reality that this is that there is plurality and there needs to be a plural political system in Yemen. Second thing is the regional identity. The problem with and I was asked by our brother here about the tension between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and that does exist. So the problem with many countries having tensions and then finding another country that actually they can exercise this. This happened in multiple times, and in here I'll try to address each party and try to address what are the mistakes that each party did commit when it comes to not helping Yemenis move forward. I'll start with the Saudis. The Saudis conducted a very big and massive air campaign that resulted into many civilian casualties. That basically didn't help bring Yemenis together, but actually created a divided nation, divided it even further. And then, because of the nature of these airstrikes, it prevented families from moving freely between different provinces, and that kind of angered a population towards all of its neighbors. Don't see that actually we can trust any of the neighbors. That's regarding the Saudis. What the United Arab Emirates did is that they supported the separatist group. And that's very problematic when you're trying to achieve peace in a country. Because no matter how much you try to give concessions, if a separatist group are continued to be supported and propped up by a foreign power, there is nothing that motivates them to come to peace. They will continue actually feeling that actually whatever they do, they need to keep on driving their agenda. So they don't need to compromise. And third, the Houthis, of course. The Houthis did, in my opinion, three fatal mistakes prior to the conflict. And of course, during the conflict, all parties, and I'm saying all parties, committed gross and horrible human rights violations. But prior to the conflict, the first thing they did is they tried to assassinate the Yemeni president. And that's a very big mistake. You don't try to assassinate an elected president, because that will basically push the country into conflict. The second, which is also important, is when they started to do military maneuvers at the border with Saudi Arabia, and actually made a very tense situation even more tense, because it gave the indication to the Gulf region that actually all of the rumors that this is a group that is supported by Iran, funded by Iran, made it a reality, because you're actually now conducting military maneuvers and opening channel between Yemen and Iran. That was unnecessary and should have never happened. The third and biggest mistake was actually the coup in September 2014, because the Houthis could have came to the table as they did during the national dialogue. They participated in the national dialogue and said, now we are going to be a political party, and then run for elections in 2015 and allow for the Yemen to basically shape itself within the normal framework of politics, elections, and basically make your argument to the public, make the public choose. The final thing is the Yemeni government and the political parties and the political elites that existed in Yemen, who now are under the umbrella of the internationally recognized government. Unfortunately, they also proven to be ineffective, inability to actually get Yemen through multiple rounds of conflict and steer Yemen safely through a transition. Because Yemen had what I call a golden opportunity during post the Arab Spring revolution. The public were energized. People were excited about the future of Yemen. People were looking forward about how things will look like in the future. But the political elite, unfortunately, and I think this is what I would like to conclude with, it's very important to focus on the leadership, because the leadership of a country is kind of the crucial element that actually can drive the country into stability, safety, and prosperity, or actually can doom it and actually push it into a conflict. And the other thing is the main problem that is happening across the Middle East, which is authoritarianism and dictatorships can never bring stability. Even if they do bring short-term stability, in the long run, it's not a permanent solution to any country. And we've experienced this in Yemen, and people say, like, if Ali Abdullah Saleh would have just continued, maybe he would have been able to stabilize the situation for a short term. But then what happens? Eventually, people die. And then if the leaders haven't created the system that actually can drive a country and move it when actually these critical moments happen, this is actually a failure of the leadership of this country. Now, I'm pretty sure soon enough there will be an opportunity when the Yemenis will have the chance to negotiate, but it will come into this. The solution in Yemen will go back into being, why not Yemenis decide to adopt a federal system that would allow each region to have an ability to run its own affairs, have a portion of its wealth, and also at the same time protect the unity and sovereignty of Yemen. And I think I want to conclude by this, because there are many sometimes hearsay and talks about what would happen if Yemen split, what would happen. Yemen is in a very important geographical location. If actually happens something to Yemen, the whole region will be affected. And it's not going to split into just two countries. It's basically you're paving the way into a more fractured state that actually the whole international community cannot afford. It's a big population, and it has a very promising potential. It is very diverse. It's very rich in its resources. It has a very vibrant society, and actually can contribute to the international community, and definitely is able to contribute to the prosperity of the whole region. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that talk. We now have time for some questions. If there are questions from anyone.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much. I've got, it's one question, but two-pronged.
Sure.
So, clearly the Saudi role is quite significant.
Yeah.
If we don't look at the declared intention of Saudi Arabia, because after a while you can study what's actually happened, and we've had enough years now to see what's actually happened on the ground in Yemen, to work out what was the true intention as opposed to the declared intention. So that's the first part of the question. We also know from what's published here that there are 5,500 British military personnel take part in supporting the campaign in Yemen, and there are 26,000 American military personnel supporting the campaign on the ground, not inside Yemen, but they support the campaign. So the question is, what is their role, and what do we understand now about what was actually intended for Yemen, now that we've had 11 years of it?
Yeah. So the first question, I think, is very, very important, because to understand modern Yemen, it's very important to understand its relations with Saudi Arabia, especially Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, let's say in Yemen, didn't had a, let's say, put it smoothly, a turbulent relationship. Sometimes it gets very well, but sometimes it doesn't. It sours. But in short, the period, especially after the 1960s and the 1970s, Yemen was heavily reliant on Saudi backing and Saudi funding, injecting literally cash into the economy, and that, in a way, made Yemen very, very dependent on Saudi Arabia. So whenever there is a problem, and Ali Abdullah Saleh did that all the time. Whenever there's a problem, he would just rush to Saudi Arabia. They would promise him, let's inject a couple of billions, and then that would kind of keep the economy afloat. But one important event that kind of changed the situation, which was the Gulf War in 1990. And Yemen at the time, under the same president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, decided to back Saddam Hussein. And by doing that, he soured the relationship with the entire Gulf region. And what they did, they expelled Yemenis, literally millions of Yemenis who had lived in the whole Gulf region for decades. And that inflicted a huge damage on the Yemeni economy that it didn't recover until today. A huge part of the unrecovery, the Yemen's economic crisis goes back to 1990. So one thing that Saudi Arabia, I think, should have done was basically resumed that relationship that existed before 1990, because you'll be boosting the economy of Yemen, while at the same time it's beneficial to a country like Saudi Arabia, because then you have a very stable neighbor. The other thing, which is Yemen moving into a republic. In 1960s, Saudis backed. There was Yemen was a kingdom, and the Saudis decided to back the kingdom against the revolution that changed Yemen into a republic. And since then, I would say Saudis didn't look at ease with Yemen being a republic at its doorstep. Millions of Yemenis live in Saudi Arabia, but also it's a different system. So that kind of like on and off would always be like, I would say, in the back of mindset of the Saudi leadership, that this is a republic, and then although like I can't say like Yemen did did have a democratic practice that actually would kind of in a way threaten the region. But that was always in the back mindset of the Saudi leadership, like not looking at ease at Yemen being a republic. But I would say, what does Saudi want? I think stability, not necessarily democracy. There's a difference between stability and democracy. And the other thing is, I think there is also a lot of confusion at the Saudi leadership today of what does it want to see in Yemen. Because if you see the last 8 years and how it ran a very complicated and frustrating coalition of many conflicting parties at the same time, goes back to this: is there isn't a clear vision of what did they want to see come out of whatever political process in Yemen. But I think this should not always be an obstacle or hurdle towards stability or peace. Both parties can agree on mutual understanding. Yemen can add something to the entire Gulf region, and the Gulf region, Yemen, as much as it needs its neighbors needs Yemen. And having a stable Yemen is in the benefit of the entire region, of the whole Gulf region. So I think there's mutual benefit to both parties if they look into the future and overcome, the historical, I would say, complications that have happened between now and then. Britain and America.
Significant numbers of military personnel on the ground.
So I don't think there are a significant number of military personnel in Yemen, per se.
For the direct operation. That's UK Parliament papers, it's not.
Yeah. But I doubt that
Saudi Arabia, they do direct
the campaign. I think for me, one of the issues that I can see, what happened was in 2015, in my opinion, I saw an international community that gave up on Yemen. Suddenly decided that actually it's not our role, and basically we're going to hand the file to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and basically you resolve the situation. And what I can say is basically again in my experience, I've documented, for example, when U.S. drone strikes were very, very active and operating in Yemen heavily. That did not create any confidence, I would say, between Yemen and especially with the system, because to have a future Yemen, you have to basically invest more in the institutions, on the state institutions. The reliance on like what happened with the United States, it got blindsided with this war on terror, and that basically shaped how it looked to Yemen. It's no longer about how we can prop up the state institutions, how we can help Yemenis build up a future and stable Yemen, but basically how we can keep the war on terror alive. And basically this became a self-defeating purpose. The more you try to do this, the more you're weakening the state institutions, and the more it comes to bite you. And it's like a vicious cycle.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of minutes for a couple of questions. Mazan, go first, and then I'll come to that side.
Thank you, brother. What is the main reason that is holding up the ceasefire at the moment?
I think the main reason is all parties are exhausted, and the thing is, there is no one single party that can win this military operation by themselves. So basically, they can continue, like the fights can continue for even a couple of more years, but they'll come up to the same conclusion. So the Saudis are tired, the Houthis are tired, and everyone is basically exhausted inside and outside Yemen. I'm not sure that the money is finished.
Great. We're going to have two final questions quickly. This on the side, and then Iqbal Qadian.
Hello. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for your lecture. Just saying, 11 years, the war is a long time, a lot of dead bodies. Do you know how many people have died? Has the population reduced? And number two, all this money that's going there to charity, is it reaching there? Because, you know, there's Christian Aid doing money, you go to shops, English people. Everybody's talking about Yemen. I mean, do you see chances of Yemen progressing within the next 5 years? Are they going to build schools, roads? Is it going to be dust, broken buildings? Any progress, do you think? Can you see it happening? Because no war has lasted for years and years and years. You know, something's got to come to a stop.
Well, the one I would say encouraging thing is this current ceasefire is holding. I mean, it's not stable. It's not, but it's been at least holding since last year. So it's been since April last year. The ceasefire has been able to sustain. So I think that's one step. And then I think the next step is basically for a meaningful and actual political process to start. And I think this comes to your second question about the aid and the humanitarian aid. In my opinion, I haven't seen any nation that can survive on humanitarian aid. But actually, you could see many countries that can survive if the aid was directed in a very very fruitful way towards helping Yemenis reinstate the state institutions. So what Yemen desperately needs is the state to operate as a state, to build roads, to build schools, build hospitals, and so on, instead of all of the resources being exhausted in conflict. And I have been very critical of the humanitarian approach because it basically turned a whole nation into basically a humanitarian recipients who are basically needy of humanitarian aid. And that's unsustainable. No matter how much you depend on the generosity of nations and people bringing donations, there's a time limit of how many times people are going to donate. So the focus should be focused on state building and helping Yemenis to rebuild the institutions that they need so they can move to the future. Until now, no, I would say, unfortunately. Unfortunately, because again, I think the focus had been so much on the humanitarian aid, and just focusing on humanitarian aid is unsustainable.
Thank you, my brother. Two short questions. One is, how many Yemenis are in Saudi Arabia, and what is their status? Can they stay as much as they want? And the second question is, what is the actual role of Iran with the Houthis? Is there any connection, or is this just hype from the Americans, or what?
The first one is the estimate is around 3 million Yemenis live in Saudi Arabia. The number of Yemenis who entered after the conflict were close to 1 million. But of course, not all of them stayed in Saudi Arabia. Some of them just went as a temporary and then moved to elsewhere. There is a big population who moved to Egypt. So Egypt remains a big. There's a big diaspora in Egypt. There is, to a less extent, but another diaspora in Malaysia, and not many, I would say, but it's increasing in number, going to Turkey. More, it's like they have the ability to be residents, but it's stable and safe, and they can still move. So those are the countries that I can think of. So, but by far, of course, Saudi Arabia remains the biggest number of Yemeni population outside Yemen is in Saudi Arabia, and that's, I think, is why it's important to understand this Yemen-Saudi ongoing, I would say, you could say it reliant, but relationship that in my opinion, I think will also continue for many years. The other thing is the role of Iran. In my opinion, I think it started as a small thing, but clearly indications by time it had increased. So the thing is, before we, including myself, I was saying that there's a lot of exaggerations, but the more you have Houthi leaders going to Iran and coming back, the more stated basically comments by the Iranian leadership regarding the situation in Yemen. It's clear like there's an ongoing at least interest and an ability to capitalize on what's happening inside Yemen. And in my opinion, I think all parties have their share of blame, whether Iran, whether Saudi Arabia, whether the United Arab Emirates, and they can disagree, I think, in many things, but I think it is time to understand that actually having a stable Yemen is in the benefit of everyone.
So this, if you like, thaw of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran may impact on the Yemeni situation.
So some people also think that the ability to extend the ceasefire is due because of Saudis and the Iranians are now talking directly. And I think this is also another thing is for a long time there's been always waiting for some intermediary to mediate between Saudi and Iran. Well, actually they should have been able to talk directly. You don't need the Americans, you don't need the Brits to come and mediate between the both countries.
And sorry, final question on the side, and then very quickly.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for your cosmetic lecture on Yemen. I've been there 3 times, but I want to ask you a question. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Sorry.
I can hear him, yeah.
Can you give me indication as to what played actually the roles at the moment up to now? Was it tribalism or was it the party politics? To me, when we were there as observers, it was tribalism. Can you expand on that, please?
So, as I said, tribalism is definitely a very important factor into this. So the regional identity exists in Yemen between the different regions and how people identify themselves. The problem, and this is why I said I tried to explain the mistakes that have been committed by each party. When I said the Houthis, the coup of September 2014, because that brought the rise of this tribal, the tribal politics even further. When they started to move from the north to the south of Yemen, basically that angered a southern population that have already been frustrated, and there has already been a separatist movement that existed in South Yemen. So that's kind of one important an important factor to it. So when the Houthis took control over the capital, they thought maybe we don't need this federal system that was agreed on the national dialogue. If we take control of the whole of Yemen, then things will be settled. A second thing, which is what I mentioned at the end, the most and biggest mistakes that many countries in the Middle East have is there isn't a system that can get them after the current dictator or the current authoritarian regime exists. So the problem is that the state structure has been always very personalized around Ali Abdullah Saleh as the president. And when he was gone, there wasn't a system in place that actually would allow for a smooth transition of power. And I think this was why the elections that was set in 2015 was important, was that specifically, because if a country doesn't have a smooth transition of power, it will descend into chaos the moment that leader either gets removed or got killed or whatever happens. So whenever there's a system that allows for a smooth transition of power, a conflict will happen.
Thank you so much for your time, but we'll have to end there. I know there are other people who may want to ask questions, but you're around for a few minutes afterwards if they want to come directly and speak to you. Thank you very much. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Reprieve is a human rights group. We work on drone strikes. We work on the Guantanamo detainees. We work on death penalty cases across in all parts of the world. It's a charity, yeah. No, it's a legal charity. So we provide legal support to victims. Like in my case,
brothers and sisters, just a few announcements. As I'm sure you're all aware, the Salam Center continues to be built on the premises just right next to us over here. If you would like to make a donation, please do speak to any member of the committee members. You can also make a donation using the payment stations both on the gents and the ladies' side.
No, it's
we also are continuing with our regular programs throughout the week. We have tafsir classes and tuition classes. All the tuition classes are on hold at the moment. We have regular Husseini Madrasa classes. If you'd like to sign up, please do go to the website, which is husseinimadrasa.co.uk, or use the QR code which will be showed on the screens. We have regular ladies yoga classes. We have ladies exercise classes. We have Dua Kamal, Surah Yasin every Thursday, and we have our regular Friday talks on a weekly basis. This is just a few of the selection of speakers that we've had last year. Today, obviously, we had Baraa Shiban, and from next week we have Mehdi Karim, who'll be speaking to us on can you maintain your faith in UK politics. And then we have Shirina Jan Muhammad, who'll be speaking to us about her new book, Story of Now, why we need to talk about the British Empire. So please do join us for all of our regular programs. And if you'd like to join our mailing list, again, you can go via our website, which is sikkim.org.uk, or you can ask any of the committee members